Hello, everybody. My name's Sophie Montagne. I'm the Head of Operations at the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. And I'm so delighted that you're able to join us this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in to the last one of our webinar series for this year. If you're new to Antarctica Insight Live, this is our programme of webinars where we explore Antarctica a bit more deeply, bringing in experts all together to get under the skin of all aspects of Antarctica. Its wildlife, its landscape, its history, and the people who have made it. We hope you're able to bring new perspectives and real experiences to provide insights into this endlessly fascinating place. We have quite a back catalogue, and you can listen back to previous events on our YouTube channel, and there are links are going to be available in the chat later. So today we are celebrating International Women's Day a few days early, and we'll be delving into the modern history of women working in Antarctica with some of the main leaders in the polar field. It was once described as the womanless continent, and yet now women feature in all aspects of Antarctic science, governance, and discovery. We're incredibly grateful to have some of the pioneering female polar leaders from the UK with us tonight. And each of them has lived through a period of really profound change in the gender balance in Antarctica. They have some absolutely amazing insights to share. So first of all, let me introduce our panel. First of all, we have Professor Dame Jane Francis, who's the Director of British Antarctic Survey. I think it's right to say the first female director of British Antarctic Survey. She's a geologist by training and joined BAS back in 1984. And Jane's area of research is using fossils to be able to investigate climate change in the polar regions. She's taken part in over 15 scientific expeditions to the Arctic and the Antarctic, and has a wealth of experience to share with us today. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. And so introduce our next guest, we have Jane Rumble. So Jane joined the Polar Regions Department of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office back in 2003 and has been head of the department since January 2007. Jane leads on all Antarctica issues for the UK government, including as head of the UK delegation of the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. She also oversees the UK's engagement with the Arctic Council, so she deals with both the North and the South. Welcome, Jane Rumble.
Thank you very much. You don't have to be called Jane to work on polar, but...
To distinguish the two, it's going to be Dame Jane going forward and Jane. And then finally, we also have Kim Crosbie. Kim's been working in the polar regions since 1991, firstly researching visitor management in the Canadian Arctic before changing her focus to Antarctica. During her PhD, Kim camped on a small island on the Antarctic Peninsula for 3 very memorable summers, developing management principles for tourist landings, which are still used in the Arctic and the Antarctic today, including at all of our UKAHT sites. Kim has also worked as a guide and an expedition leader in both polar regions for 15 years. She was executive director of the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, helping to promote safe and environmentally responsible travel and Antarctic tourism. She chairs our board of trustees at the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust and is an industry advisor to the UK delegation to the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings. So thank you all. Thank you, Kim. Thank you all for joining us today. What a lineup. Quite intimidating for me to be able to host this discussion, but I think we've got so many interesting areas that we'd love to cover and probably not an awful lot of time. So to kick off with, I'd really love to know some of your experiences as a woman in a man's world in the early part of your careers and some of the challenges that you faced through that process. So perhaps Dame Jane, if you could start, and obviously women weren't even allowed to work in the field in Antarctica until 1983. Is that something that was an issue for you? And how did you go about managing your position as a woman in the early parts of your career?
Well, actually, I was a scientist and I was just dedicated to my science. So actually, to be honest, I didn't really take much notice of it. I just got on with the science. I worked for BAS for just a couple of years in the 80s. Then I came back as director. But in the middle, I actually was working in a university and came to Antarctica and the Arctic first and Antarctica to work. Actually, women were allowed to work in the field before in Antarctica in the UK before 1993. It's just that was a particular date when women were allowed to camp in the field. So before that, I know there were some women geologists that worked there. They worked in the field all day, but they went back to the ship at night. So the big change was to be able to camp there in 1993. But in other nations had already done that. That's a picture of me with some of my New Zealand colleagues, actually, when we were way, way isolated in the Antarctic, transantarctic mountains. And you can see we're brown, not just from suntan, but also from 3 or 4 months in Antarctica without any water close by. But that was a hard season, but that was great fun. And I just camped with them just like anybody else. So they were all good friends.
And at that time, Jane, did you find that there was pushback for you as a young woman in this environment? And were your colleagues or was management higher up trying to challenge your position there?
I honestly, at that time, I didn't. Like I said, I was a scientist. I was really interested in understanding what Antarctica was like in the past. I worked, as you can see in this photo, I worked on fossil plants that are preserved in the rocks in Antarctica. I was really interested in the climate of Antarctica millions of years ago. And that now is really relevant because one of the big topics in science that we're interested in Antarctica is how the climate is changing today. And that it's really changed now. Antarctica is changing and it's having a global impact. So Antarctic science is no longer something that happens at the end of the world and nobody else cares about it. It's really, really important now. It is having a planetary wide impact.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's something that obviously you're involved with on the scientific side. And Jane Rumble, if I could bring you in at this stage to talk about, the impact on the governance side. And you joined the Polar Regions Department in 2003. And what was that like for you? And what had you done before that with the Foreign Office that could impact how you were perceived and treated as a woman?
Well, I arrived to the polar world slightly randomly from a previous position in the Department of Health. Before that, I was in the Department of Environment, so I had been a fairly typical generalist bureaucrat before arriving in the polar world. I didn't necessarily expect that I would stay in the polar world forever. I just thought it'd be rather exciting. I'm a geographer by background, so really interested in physical issues as well as social issues. So the polar world kind of brings all of that in together. So I arrived kind of slightly daunted because it's a very technical issues to be working on, lots of different issues. My kind of first international meeting really was I represented the UK at the Committee of Environmental Protection, which is the environmental body that advises the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, of which I'm now the head of delegation. And the CEP is kind of the technical body. And in 2004, we were in South Africa and we were talking at one point about adventure tourism. And we were getting a bit kind of bogged down in what a definition of adventure tourism was. So in order to move the conversation on, I said something like, we don't need to define it. We know what it is when we see it. Quoting something else. And then the environmental lobby group, who used to in those days produce a daily newspaper of how the diplomats had failed to make really very much progress, which was normally quite insulting. The headline of the next day was "Mary Whitehouse has arrived in Antarctica," to which I thought, well, they wouldn't have said that if I was male. But my male boss at the time was just delighted that I'd kind of made my impact. So I was kind of trying to row back from this reputation in the early days. So that for the first 3.5 years, I was deputy head of the department. So I had a male leader. He was the third person to hold the job that I have now since 1943. So he took early retirement at the time that it was a sort of time for me to start another job. And I thought, well, we can't both leave, so maybe I should apply for this. And amazingly, they gave it to me. And that was when I also then represented the UK at the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And that's the bit of the Antarctic Treaty System that looks at the Southern Ocean and is really looking at fish quotas. So because of the economic angle of the discussions, it's a little bit more of a brutal forum to exist in. And I was one of 3 female heads of delegation in the first year. That was quite the eye opener of dealing with a lot of people who didn't really think that I should be the boss, didn't talk to me. Some people didn't look me in the eye. So I had a very supportive team who just kept calling me boss to kind of underline it. So within the UK team, I had no issues, but still now dealing with some cultures can be challenging.
Really interesting, like absolutely fascinating to hear that was still the case then. And so, as you just touched on there, it has actually changed now. Are you much more accepted? Is there a much higher ratio of women on those delegations?
Well, yeah, there's kind of now probably at least half, I would say, of female heads of delegation. So it's much more sorted. I think we have some challenging discussions, and some of the countries that are probably less likely to be like-minded with us are still very male-dominated delegations. And so one of the challenges, I think, is that if they're not listening, which may or may not be gender related, this can be a little bit of a challenge. So yeah, it still comes home to roost sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kim, your background is so varied in so many different areas, from research to tourism to governance and all sorts. Do you have any particular examples of when being a woman has been a challenge?
Yeah, well, I think well, going back to Dame Jane's comment to start with, I think it turned out that I mean, a bit like Dame Jane, I was so fascinated by the work that we were doing and I was so focused and excited about that when I first went south to do research. Yeah, there I am, looking particularly grumpy, clutching a penguin chick. That I wasn't really aware of what was going on, and actually, with hindsight, I think I was extraordinarily lucky because my route was very much outside of the establishment. So the first time I went to Antarctica was in 1992, and we were camping at that point. But we went as part of the Scott Polar Research Institute, and we were doing research under that guise. And I do remember that the head of operations at British Antarctic Survey at the time was not best pleased and did give us quite a hard time about talking to them. And the fact that we were going south. I think there was a lot of concern that maybe we wouldn't make it. But yeah, I worked there, but I've been extraordinarily lucky in doing that. And then also once I finished my PhD, or actually just slightly before that, I started working in the expedition cruise industry. And actually, you would expect, well, A, in the Antarctic, and then B, working at sea, that you'd be in a very male-dominated environment. But in actual fact, within the expedition cruise business in the early days, so in the 80s and early 90s, there wasn't a huge number of ships operating. I think there was 2, and then it crept up to 4, and then it was 5 ships total. And within those, there was a really strong cohort of super strong women. And it wasn't worth anybody's while to try and either patronize them or to do anything to undermine them. So I think, again, I was very, very lucky that I had some very good role models in that game. And it was just that you didn't think twice about the fact you were female. You just got on and did the job. And we were expected to be as strong. The picture before him was, coming back after doing a landing in South Georgia, where out of nowhere a katabatic wind came up and it went literally from nothing to 70 knots of wind. And actually, what you can't really see in that photo, but at that point, the 4 best Zodiac drivers were all female. We called ourselves the Gods, which was the girls' only driving squadron. And and you had to deal with it. You just had to deal with whatever the conditions threw at you, and get everyone back, get the boats back, make sure everyone's safe. And if you ended up with several bucketfuls of water at 0 degrees over the top of you, that was just life. And it was incredibly invigorating and incredibly good fun, I have to admit. So yeah, that was good. So yeah, so I think I've been very very lucky in that thing, in that route. And I think really it's only sort of in later life when you started taking more leadership roles and you were having to start to work with other communities that you really started to come across this. And it was, at best, I have to say, it's extremely entertaining when somebody just assumes you're the secretary or the whatever, and it's like, no, actually, I'm afraid I'm the one you're dealing with. It's me. So, and my tactic for most conflict is humor. is just, you know, try and take the wind out the sails and go, no, this is it. So, but yeah, it has been quite entertaining. And I've seen, you know, again, I've seen Dame Jane and Jane Rumble in action, you know, facing a wall of grey suited men who made the mistake of underestimating them, and they do that at their peril. So
absolutely, yeah. And that was kind of leading to my next question, because I've also seen all of you in action as well, and there's so much to learn from it. And as someone younger in a leadership role in this kind of area, there's so much to learn from how you have all learned to deal with misogyny in your roles. And it would just be really great to have any insights from how, I know, Kim, you mentioned humour, and it's a great way to deflect everything. And I think perhaps Dame Jane and Jane Rumble have different techniques as well.
Well, I think, yes, I think humour. I mean, it's my feeling is, well, it's their problem, not mine, you know. So, and it's not worth making a fuss about, to be honest. It's because, you know, then I have a role in that. That's it. I remember I completely agree with Kim, though. I mean, I think I really noticed the misogyny more in the leadership position. Nobody expects a woman to be the director of British Antarctic Survey. I'm sitting at the back there, but I will tell you about Jane Rumble in a moment, sitting in that seat. But when I first arrived in the British Antarctic Survey in Bass, I was unpacking all my boxes one evening in the first week that I was there, and somebody was helping me, a security guard, and after a couple of hours, happy chats and sorting everything out, they said, "Well, are you the director's new secretary then?" And so, and for the first year or two, I got things like comments in that vein quite often. You know, who's your boss then? You know, and what are you director of? Which bit of Bass are you director of? You know, well, I'm in Bass in charge of director of everything. You know, and there would be a stunned look and embarrassment actually in many cases. And the interesting thing, it wasn't just sort of senior people; it was also younger people as well, younger men. And so, you know, I've got used to it now, and I can just give them a very stern look. But I did learn to do a few things. So, you know, you do have to. I remember when I was chairing meetings, I do think women sometimes have different ways of working, and I certainly prefer to work in a group of people. I'm not. You know, I don't have a deputy. I have a team of people that I work with, and I was able to structure that when I got here. And I much prefer working like that, working in teams. You know, a problem shared is a problem divided up, and you can consult. You know, I can consult them, and they can help me. So that's really important. So, and I think that's slightly different. And I've also got used to. But if I need to be show people I'm in charge, for instance, in a meeting, I sit at the end of the table because I learned to my peril. If you sit in the middle because you want to be part of a group, you don't automatically get recognised as the leader of that group by the men around the table. So I sit at the top of the table if I see that there's a male-dominated group. But so there are some tactics that I've used, but on the whole, now I think people know more or less in my environment who I am, and I just cope with it. I have to say, though, I'm going to hand over to Jane Rumble because Jane Rumble is formidable. And so Jane goes to the Antarctic Treaty meetings, which are very, there you go, there she is sitting there. She's, you know, this is a political meeting. It's got people from different nations sitting around the table once a year. Some of them are very old-fashioned in their approach to why women should be there. And some, you know, but Jane has got now the reputation for being really forthright, very clear, very knowledgeable in her job. And when there's a tricky situation that comes up, I can see that most of the sort of 29 people sitting around that big U-shaped table look at Jane to see what is she going to say. You know, they really trust and respect what she says. So well done to Jane.
And I have to say, I've seen the stern looks from both Janes in action, and yeah, you don't get on the wrong side of those. And Jane, have you Jane Rumble had any experiences as well that you can share on that front? I'm sure plenty.
Yes, plenty. I was just kind of firstly, I'm hoping my boss is watching this after that accusation. Yes, I think as Dame Jane says now, we're both pretty well known, so there are very few people that we have to deal with being confused about who we are now. But certainly in the early years, sometimes I found it quite useful, actually, that if people wouldn't really know who I was, I would lull them into a false sense of security by slightly playing along with being the person that would just sort of ask the sort of dumb blonde questions, which is what they sort of expected from me. And then halfway through the meeting, I would just sort of cough loudly and say, well, right then, this is what we're going to do now. Thanks very much. So it can work to your advantage a little bit, but I can't obviously do that now. Yeah.
I think what's also really interesting is that, when we think of all the UK polar leaders, almost all of them are female. So with the three of you that are here, Camilla, our CEO of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, certainly when I started working in polar areas, it seemed to me that the majority of leaders were female, and definitely I think increasingly at BAS, Dame Jane, if I'm correct, there's a head of science is now female and a head of innovation, and it seems like the top offices around BAS are increasingly becoming female. And it would be really great to hear how your experiences, having been in the game for so long, all of you at the top of your game for so long, that longevity is amazing, and then how you can pay that forward to future female leaders who will follow after you.
Well, I'll just answer here. Yeah, that's a picture of me on a panel, because I've also worked in the Arctic and go to big meetings in the Arctic, and you can see there's a panel of women there, so that lots of women in the Arctic. So there are senior leaders, not quite the director of science at the moment, but there are senior leaders in BAS. But actually, the most impressive thing, I think, is that many of my colleagues, my counterparts in other nations, directors of national polar programs, are now women. So when I go to a conference now, so at Antarctic Treaty meeting, there must be 5 or 6 of us that can get together and have our photo taken as women who are in charge of Antarctic programs in Antarctica. And that really has changed over the last few years, and that is really a great thing to see. And I think there's a great collegiality between us women, but all of the polar leaders. I really think I don't think it necessarily matters that you're a woman when you're trying to get the job done. So you just have to make sure you're in there as an equal. So that's really important. Yeah. But I think it is really important to see women in these situations as role models. I mean, there's a lot of literature about this, that younger people need to be able to see women in the senior positions, and so that they know those positions are open and it's something they can aspire to. But I think a lot of people, it's not just females, but definitely females as well as men, but they need to be able to see. I think women need to be a little bit more encouraged to take up leadership positions when they're younger. They need to be able to say, right, okay, do you want to aim for a position like that? And then they need some mentoring, and they need some just support, just to give them the confidence that they can do it. And there's a lot of talk about how hard it is, but actually, if you've got the confidence, if you've got the experience, if you've got support and mentoring, I think it makes it a lot easier.
Go back to your point though, Sophie, on what do we do to kind of encourage the next generation? And as Dame Jane said, we now know that Antarctica is critical for how the planet works. It's moving our oceans and our atmosphere, and what happens in Antarctica is coming to a living room near you if it melts. But also, what is the future of Antarctica? What are we using it for? It's increasing numbers of tourists are visiting Antarctica. Mostly that's done entirely environmentally responsibly, but it's up to humanity, kind of what we do with it. We've prohibited commercial mineral exploitation, but that's an agreement amongst governments that also can change. So in order to kind of work out what do we want to do with it, we want that to be a discussion that is formed of voices of the representation of humanity. So we do a big project with the British Antarctic Survey and all of our other stakeholders, including the Antarctic Heritage Trust, on diversity in polar science. We kicked that off at the 200th anniversary of the discovery of Antarctica, partly because, if you look at the history books for the first 150 years, you wouldn't realize that there were any women that had any involvement, probably didn't even know where Antarctica was, and certainly wouldn't put a pair of boots on. It seems to be how history is written. So we wanted to kind of readdress that, but also to make sure that we were doing as much as we could to encourage everybody. Kind of polar science needs all the talents, so we need to ensure that we're encouraging young people, and we're also encouraging other people in mid-career or late career in whatever discipline. Kind of Antarctica needs you to be thinking about what its future is going to be. So there's been a lot of work to try and encourage a much more diverse future. Despite our polar pioneering in the UK, that's not the case for every country. So more broadly, talking about making sure that everybody gets their voice heard is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kim, in the sort of with your tourism hat on here, there's an awful lot of very passionate expedition crew who are all female, and expedition leaders and all sorts. And is there a kind of pathway there for mentoring and for people to, again, with the expedition crew on the ships, is it a case of identifying people that could be leaders and then needing to give them a bit more support to take on those positions?
Yeah, definitely. And again, being sort of slightly outside of the program's governmental slide, there's been a lot more, well, being more commercial, basically, there's been a lot more scope to bring other communities and, diversity, not just in gender, but in a lot of other respects. So, yeah, and it's, I think what's really, really lovely to see, I was just, when I was south again just now, it is this next generation is coming through. Again, I would say it's 50-50 male female. We know at Port Lockroy, it's traditionally, well, not traditionally, but there's always been a very high proportion of women running Port Lockroy since the UKAHT took it over, and it works really well. And I think part of the whole mentoring program and part of encouraging people to go through it is, I mean, in a way, it's what you would do for anybody. This, you want to show them, you want to give them the tricks of leadership, you want to provide support. Everybody's different. They have different ways of handling different situations. They have, you both in Lockroy, but on the ships as well, you're in quite an isolated community. So it's quite an unusual set of circumstances that you're working with. But yeah, there's systems in place. There's if anybody out there wants to become a polar guide, there's various routes into that, whether that's initially doing research at, being a marine biologist or whatever, or a geologist or a historian, etc. Although it tends to be the older generation that become historians, because then they can just sit at the bar and tell stories. So there's quite a lot of male historians still, but there is a pathway for the next route up. You learn your skills. There's a set of standards now that there's different organizations are doing it, and some companies are doing it. But for example, there's a Polar Tourism Guides Association that's providing a framework for people to learn and then work their way through. But it's a really, I think one of the tricks of leadership is knowing how to bring the best out of the people in your team. So they're doing the best, they're being the best person they possibly can be for the organization. And the experience of being in these little isolated communities, whether that's on board a ship or in Lockroy or in a field camp or at a research base, is a really good grounding in that, because you learn a lot about other people and how to get along with them and how to get the best out of them. And everybody's sort of learning that on the route. Some are better than others, but I think it's an invaluable experience. So again, if you were looking for a leader, I think somebody who's been through that sort of experience is have a look at them, because they'll have learned a lot from that intense interaction with other people. Oh, I think we might have lost your sound.
Am I back in?
Oh, there you are. You're back.
Okay, back in. I think it's what's really obvious as well is seeing the kind of the Antarctic community is so small, and once you're involved in it, you kind of meet everybody over and over. And I wonder whether it's so tight knit as well, which is really special and quite unique, and it's very what makes Antarctica and the treaty so unique, and the fact that people do all work together. Do you think the unity that we have and that kind of warm atmosphere within the polar kind of sphere, or British polar sphere at least, is partly because there are lots of women in top positions who help to kind of keep those relationships going? It's open to the floor, that one.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps. I think there's another actor in all of this, and that is the Antarctic environment.
Yeah.
Because when you're down there,
yeah,
you know, it's in charge. I mean, I think one of the things that's so appealing about it is the fact that you have to be humble. I mean, no book, no film, nothing can portray the scale and, you know, how important it is. So until you actually go there and experience it, and it feels so small. I mean, one of the reasons why I think tourism is okay, and we need to work to make sure that it stays in a environmentally friendly way. But I do think it's quite important for people to experience that, because there's very few places left in the world where you can really actually appreciate we're just one species in an ecosystem, and it, you know, there's no doubt about it. But because the environment is so harsh, you have to work together as a team. So, you know, within the tourism community, all the different companies, their competitors north of 60, but south of 60, they have to work as a fleet. They have to support each other so we don't impinge on national Antarctic programs, etc. So I think if you've experienced that and you've been humbled by it, then you work as, you know, you have a natural affinity to other people who've been through all of that. You know, there's an understanding. So I think that's a big part of it as well.
Yeah.
But
I totally agree with Kim. I think all of that. I think, you know, Antarctica is a very, very special place. You know, the people that don't get on only go once. They get sifted out quite quickly. And so what's left are people who are desperate always to go back, desperate to share that experience. It is a very unique experience. And if you work there for months or long time, and you know, it is isolated, it is tough, it's but it's also very beautiful, and like Kim says, it does make you really humble. You know that you are a small thing in a very big environment that's incredibly powerful, with all the glaciers, with the ice, with the climate, and with those amazing penguins. So and being there is really humbling, and it's also about shared experience, because the feeling you get when you're in Antarctica is really special. And I think that it is something that binds everybody together. And so, you know, I think it's people who've been there once and they really, really like it and they're really in tune with it, want to keep going back and back and back. So it is an amazing place. It captures you.
Absolutely. I think there's just no denying that. If it gets under your skin, then it's like an obsession. And whether you want to go back or support it or work within that field to protect it is something that you can kind of never let go of. Flashing back here to an expedition I did in 2017, and I hadn't been back until this season when I got to go and see Port Lockroy for the first time, and went 7 years later to a completely different part of the continent, having been at the South Pole before. And it just blew my mind in every possible way that Port Lockroy could be so beautiful, that the peninsula could be so spectacular. And all the people I met within that kind of tourism side that I was experiencing with the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust was just this wonderful atmosphere of everybody being as passionate as you were about this incredibly unique place. And even the tourists as well on board, just everybody had something to talk about because of the amazing things that everybody was seeing and sharing. So there's definite value to that, I think.
And I think for me, it kind of comes back to the point that, you know, this is a question for everybody. And so, you know, I'm not sure, maybe having more women just helps making sure that there's more diversity, but it's not just, you know, kind of gender diversity, it's all sorts of other diversity, but also, you know, I need to make sure that we are listening to all the different constituent parts of Antarctica. In the, you know, Dame Jane definitely makes sure that I hear the voices of scientists, and Kim definitely makes sure I hear the voices of the tourist industry, but there are others as well, and all of those voices need to be heard in order to kind of come up with the best example. If we all just agreed with each other and we were all coming from exactly the same perspective, we'd probably be going in the wrong direction. We need that kind of debate and challenge, and we need it to be open, and we need it to be about Antarctica and not about kind of particular egos or vested interests. And that's, I think, the commitment that we all have to make sure that we do that.
Absolutely. I'm conscious that we are running out of time here. This discussion could go on all evening, and I just think we're so lucky to have you all in a room to be talking about such an interesting subject. But I have a feeling we have some questions from audience that we can share. There we go. Said the landscape is increasingly female in Antarctic leadership. What do women bring to Antarctica that is needed?
Well, I can start with some of that. I think when you're working in a team in Antarctica, which is what most people do. I think it just makes the team more natural. I think everybody has a different perspective that can bring to team environment, and women do just part of a normal environment. So not having them there is fine, and it's fine to have all women as well. But I think natural society is a mixture of males, females, all kinds of people with all kinds of diversity. So it just makes it more natural, I think.
In the diplomatic space, I mentioned that I was one of only 3 women at the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources in the early days, talking about fish. We did actually, once we got to about 7 or 8 of us, we would have heads of delegation, female heads of delegation lunches, and kind of discuss various issues. And one of our big campaigns, in fact, was to get more toilets in the building, because there were so few of us that we were allowed 3, and that was it. So now I'm pleased to say the building has been reorganised. This meeting always takes place in Hobart in Tasmania every year, and the headquarters now has 2 sets of female toilets. So there's kind of less of a queue, thankfully. So.
Yeah. And I think the only thing I would add is and this is, for a while I worked with one of the companies that, or was involved with, tangentially worked with one of the companies that was involved with supporting expeditions to the South Pole, for example. And you would have teams that would come along, and they would be very, busy, proud, being the fastest or the quickest or the first to juggle refrigerators or whatever. I mean, it wasn't quite that bad, but not far off it. But I think what was really impressive was that in the briefing you would hear about how the importance of protecting yourself and covering up and this, that, and the next thing. And the example that was always put was that it would always be the guys who would be heading to the South Pole, and they would deliberately allow themselves to get incredibly sunburnt, or they would end up with frostbite or this, that, next thing, because they weren't taking care of themselves. Whereas the women would all be, they would listen, they would cover up their face, they would have no exposed skin, and they would arrive at the South Pole just, as they'd set off, albeit a bit thinner and fitter, like you, Sophie, like you did. So it's I think there's I think Dame Jane hit on it, that every voice, every community has a voice, and that's why it's really important to listen to all of them to get to the right decisions, to get to move along in the right direction. And it was the same within IAATO, and I think just it would be ridiculous not to have women involved. I mean, it would just be nonsensical. So different individuals bring different attributes and different strengths to the conversation, and we have to celebrate every single one of them. Absolutely. Even if we don't agree, first off. Yeah.
And just going back to the thing about women on expeditions. So our expedition was all females. We were the first female team to cross the continent, and it was very interesting to we were involved in lots of medical research, and they compared our team to an all-male team that did a similar route, and the physiological difference between our team and the male team was absolutely extraordinary. To see that many years ago women weren't welcome in the Antarctic, and actually the reality from the science was to see that over a 60-day expedition our bodies adapted within 2 weeks to the new reality of skiing for 10 hours a day and covering 46 kilometers with a sledge behind you. Female body just adapted, lost a bit of weight, got really, really strong, but didn't lose too much weight and didn't lose muscle. And for the male team, they lost masses of weight. Their bodies started consuming their muscle, and they came back looking, as Kim described, scorched and shriveled. And it was really interesting to see the actual physiological science behind how the female body can adapt to any environment, and then the assets that can bring to any team, no matter what the sort of environment that you're in. I think there's a few, before I get carried away, there are a few more questions coming through. Here we go. I'm interested in the development of arts and culture in Antarctica. As female leaders, how important do you feel it is to develop in this area, or is there intrigue in the mystery of it?
That's a very good question. I also, I'm a big believer that arts and culture has a really important role in terms of the messaging and getting, and communicating and interpreting and understanding as well. And so I think from that perspective, that because the Antarctic there are so many stories there about the heritage, about the science, about the current science, but also about the future science that Dame Jane was touching on at the FAST, and Jane was mentioning as well. What happens in Antarctica doesn't stay in Antarctica, and it's really important that we all know those stories. So I think in terms of the development of arts and culture, there's a massive space and need to get more of these stories out and do that. So yeah, I think there's lots of scope for that. That would be a great thing. The mystery's good, but I do think we've got a big communication challenge ahead of us.
Yeah, and I think as scientists, we are also working with artists and musicians, even dancers, because the science is really important, and scientists can communicate in one way, but there's lots of other ways that scientists need to communicate, and through art, writing, media, text, everything, dance, music, are different ways of communicating the really important science messages that we need to convey.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. I mean, we're talking about diversity. People learn and hear things in different ways, and so the more diversity of messaging that you've got, the more kind of the better the audience is going to be. So when you're dealing with young children, for example, you want to be doing that through kind of arts and kind of softer messages, but you can also reach other audiences through music. The Antarctic Symphony, for example, was a real kind of way of bringing people together, and hopefully that kind of untaps a curiosity that then brings them into thinking about, well, what is this place and why should I worry about it? And yes, you should worry about it, and yes, you should learn about it in order to think about what its future is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such an emotive place. It's hard not to be moved by it in a way that could spark creativity if you have the talent, which unfortunately I definitely don't. From my watercolors on board on the Hurtigruten ship earlier, I think it was my 5-year-old could do better. What's the impact of the lack of women in Antarctica's history? And that's an interesting question, obviously, to see how that's changing as stories come forward.
I wonder whether kind of, I mean, when we were sorry, we can hear the next generation coming forward. Exactly. I sort of wonder whether the fact that women sort of really hit Antarctica quite late, I wonder if that is partly to do with sort of it being airbrushed out of some of the history and this sort of myth that it was too difficult. Women were distracting. They wouldn't be up for it. They wouldn't be able to cope. And yeah, here we have some of the early pioneers of Antarctic science demonstrating that actually, once you started to see women, more women came forward. And I think that's the point, really, isn't it? That you need to see people in roles doing things that will inspire you to think, well, yes, I can do that, and yes, that is an option, and I can follow in their footsteps. So I think, yeah, the impact of the history is that it sort of probably took longer to get to where we are now.
Yeah, and I think there's some great examples. I think of groups where there was I can't remember her name, which is really annoying. A Antarctic scientist who'd been working in the field for years and years and years, and finally got a chance to go south and do her research in Antarctica. But they insisted that she recruited another cohort of women. So I think there were 4 or 5 of them that went all as one team, so that it could be a whole group of women rather than one woman slotting into an otherwise male environment, which I thought was an interesting approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. Do you have any advice for pursuit of careers in Antarctica and its heritage without the need to access formal or higher education?
I think that's a Kim question.
Yes.
Because, for science, yes. I mean, you can go to Antarctica and help with science, but on the whole, if you really want a career in Antarctica in science, then you do need to have scientific background. But I think Kim's got the answer.
Yeah, I quit my higher education. I got as far as I could, and then I thought, no, I'll quit while I'm ahead. Yeah, so I think, well, if you look at what's happening in Antarctica, there's 3-4 big industries that are actually taking place. One is the science one, or activities, let's say. One is science, one is the logistics and supportive science, tourism, and fishing. I wouldn't do the fishing thing. I think that's quite tough. And anyway, yeah, well, it's not my cup of tea, put it that way. but certainly in logistics and in the tourism industry, there's lots of options to have a look at. And for example, look at the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. I think right now we're recruiting for a carpenter. So if you've got conservation carpentry skills, have a look there, and do watch that. And there's other charities such as the South Georgia Heritage Trust as well that are also, they do the odd recruitment too. So there's other positions that are for different skill sets. And I think, again, when it comes back to diversity, which isn't just about gender, it's about all sorts of things. We as humans, as a community, need to have all these different skill sets in order for all of us to move forward. So, I think there's I would say, if you're interested, follow. Then you will see some of the job opportunities that are coming up. So follow on Instagram, follow on the social media, the different communities that are working down there. If you want to work in the tourism industry, learn to drive a boat, learn to have at least 17 minutes on each penguin species, and be able to talk endlessly about salps, because that's also a good thing, and krill and ice and whatever. You could do a lot of homework and then you'll be good to go.
And even in the British Antarctic Survey, you can also have another career. If you haven't got a science background, you can work as huge number of opportunities to work in the logistics, the support of science. So we have, in terms of females, we have a female pilot that flies aircraft across Antarctica. It's amazing. We have ship engineers that go on the ship behind me here, and we'd love to have more. So more pilots, more engineers, but more computer people. The sciences needs computer people, which don't necessarily have to come in with a science background. That's really critical. But we have doctors in Antarctica. You name it, there are different logistic support roles that anybody can do.
And also, of course, we can't all go to Antarctica, sadly, although it is amazing, and I would recommend it if you can. But of course, we can't love Antarctica to death, so we can't have the whole of humanity going to Antarctica. We need to make sure that it's managed. So we also try very hard to bring Antarctica home, to get people to think about Antarctica from whatever walk of life they're in. So we have an educational website, which is discoveringantarctica.org.uk, which fits into the geography curriculum, so people can learn about Antarctica. And then, there are many things that would spin out of that. I mean, you might get into thinking about how you go around your daily lives in a way that might have less of an impact on the environment, that will have a beneficial, consequential impact on Antarctica. Thinking about our climate is driven by Antarctica. The Arctic kind of drives our daily weather. These things are both impacted by what we do. So thinking about those sorts of things as well in an Antarctic context is something that we try to promote, that you don't have to necessarily go to Antarctica, although that is rather good. But to think about Antarctica, you don't necessarily all need to go there.
And I think, just to add to that, probably the common thread in all of our different fields is that you need to have a certain sort of personality type or a certain skill set and it's not something you can necessarily train, it's something you have. So a flexibility of mindset to be able to deal with the constantly changing landscape, constantly. The weather affects everything. It affects all of your activities, all of your plans. Everything that we do is dictated by the weather with the Antarctic Heritage Trust, the Port Lockroy teams and our field teams on the conservation sites. The team currently at Blake Lock, they have a plan and they change it every hour almost because of the situation that's changing on the ground. So to be someone that embraces change, I think, is really important, and to see the excitement in that instead of getting stressed by it. And then, as all of you have said all the way through, an ability to be a really strong member of a team and to really enjoy that collegiate atmosphere and being able to feel that you're part of something really big and really important and a very small sort of team in a very huge place, with the enormous privilege of being able to work there. And certainly when we're recruiting, that's the kind of mindset that we look for: flexibility and real proper team players who are happy to get stuck in with whatever Antarctica may throw at them.
I was told when I first started working down there, the thing to live by was be flexible or thou shalt be bent out of shape. And it's a pretty good adage so, for life.
I'm going to take that one. Love it. So we've got here, Kathleen Scott said that women could get to the huts on the coast, but no further. What do you make of that? I disagree personally, but
she was a product of her time, I think.
I think, yeah, in the past, I think it depends how you read that. A lot of women could only get to the coast, as I mentioned before, and the deep field and sort of the rigors of camping and working in deep field really weren't allowed, or they were allowed in many nations. The New Zealanders and America had women as part of their teams a long time before the British, but yeah, of course, women can go anywhere in Antarctica, and the further you go inland, the more exciting it is. Although, no, nothing to, yeah, everywhere is exciting in Antarctica. But isolation, I really like isolation. As more and more experience, I absolutely love to go as a geologist, going into a field camp and be totally isolated, and leaving the rest of the world behind for a few months, and just being able to focus on. I always say three things. Focus on three things: the rocks and the science that I had to do. The weather, because the weather, like you say, is changeable and you have to be flexible, and so you have to be prepared for that. And the third thing is what you're going to have for dinner, because food is just you're always hungry because you're burning so many calories, and then how you're going to turn mostly dried food that's at the back of your tent into something edible and nourishing was always a challenge that you thought about from breakfast onwards. Yeah.
It is undeniable, though, that the technological advances in Antarctica make life a lot easier. Of course, from the days of Captain Scott. I mean, even more recently than that, my first British Antarctic Survey kit bag in 2003, all of it was for men. So none of it fitted properly. The sort of the knee pads were in the wrong place. The jacket didn't do up properly. That's a better example. That's a little bit more recent. So yeah, the fact that it's now more comfortable, there's much better connectivity. You can get pretty high-speed internet now, kind of in Antarctica. The modern base facilities that we have is really to, the investment really is to make the science as easy and as efficient as it possibly can be, and sort of do away with the hardships. That you still get the odd expedition that wants to do it in, Shackleton type clothing and so on and so forth. But really now it's you want to keep people safe. You want them to be able to deliver what it is they've gone to Antarctica to do, and get that done and get out. So I think that has made it a little bit probably easier and more accessible.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say, I'd like to highlight the safety issue, because it is really important to stay safe in Antarctica. And although we've talked about it being glorious and a fantastic environment and a great place to go and everything, it is also quite risky at times. The weather is changeable. It is fierce. You are isolated. You are in the middle of nowhere. The winds do blow really cold, and you can get frostbite. And you get if you're seriously hurt, you are a long way from a decent hospital. So you do have to be very, very careful about safety. You have to be self-aware. You have to be aware of others. You have to look after others, and you have to assess risks all the time. So on the top of my list of everything is safety in Antarctica and keeping people safe. Very important.
Top of my list too. Absolutely. Next question. What are you most proud of in your career so far? Probably best to work around the room. Does anyone got something straight off the top of their head, or should I just pick you at random? I'll look at Jane Rumble.
Gosh, so that's a really hard question, because you want to constantly be striving. I think for me, kind of, my delivery really is very much through others and through getting the best out of the teams and the stakeholders. So we have had some really good successes. So the UK negotiated the first ever marine protected area in Antarctica. That was really massively underpinned by British Antarctic Survey science. We then got an agreement that there would be protection for areas that were newly exposed from ice shelf collapse, to prevent them from being degraded before you could get in to do some science. Again, kind of a real scientific argument. Kim and I went on an early expedition in 2006 to draft the first site guidelines. I was completely useless. I just, had a clipboard and a note and wrote down everything Kim said. We now have a whole suite of Antarctic site guidelines that the tourism industry use, and the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators has got more than 100 of these things, which really makes the sort of landing of sites much more environmentally friendly. It really kind of makes people think about what they're going to do there. So yeah, anything that provides makes Antarctica better, actually delivers something on the ground, the things that I get most proud of.
And Kim, as you fed into that, do you want to carry on from there?
Yeah, I think as you progress through your life and career, the most satisfaction and the most rewarding aspect is bringing other people along, or watching the next generation. I mean, we stood on the shoulders of people before us who'd done all the work, and UKAHT is very good at telling those stories of the people in the huts, etc. And it's just being part of that next thing. So knowing when to hand over, I think that's very important. But also, but then seeing the next generation, and and watching them take it forward, and they've got a totally different skill set, because they have to. I mean, I'm turning into that person who's like, I need a young person to work out how to do this or whatever. Anyway, I'm sort of slightly turning that way. But I think it's watching. I think that's really fulfilling. And you have different ideas of what you want out of life as you progress through it. But I genuinely think that's the thing that's really makes you proud and is rewarding, is to watch the next generation move things along. And it's really nice to see that in IAATO. So when I was head of IAATO, I did that for however long. But anyway, the current head is also female, and she's really taking things, and it's existential what she's dealing with now compared to what I was dealing with, and just the way that they're building and the community is building on top of that is it's great to see. So it's nice to have been a little part of that, a stepping stone on the way. So that's really good.
Absolutely. And Dame Jane, what to pick?
Well, it's a similar vein. I think I'm most proud of the British Antarctic Survey, because everybody here is fantastic. It's brilliant to be working here. I think, the science that we do is really, really critical. And there's some amazing people here, both in the scientists, but also in the people who go to Antarctica or stay in Cambridge, work in Cambridge and support it all. And I think they just mostly love it, and they dedicate their lives to it, and it's just a fantastic place to work. And I think I'm also, so for me, as a scientist that used to do science in the past, some of the discoveries I've made in the past, it's been fantastic, and it's nice to have a step in the pathway of the science story that we know now. So yeah, and actually pushing myself. I never ever thought when I was younger that I would end up going to Antarctica, going to the Arctic, working. I worked in Central Australia in the heat and doing all that kind of really adventurous stuff. That was never ever in my mind when I was at school. It just opened doors, and I think I'm proud that I can walk so far in a day and have the stamina to keep going at night, and then go home back to a tent and cook dinner. That was quite a good achievement, I think, as you know, Sophie.
Yeah. And I think also go Jane.
I was going to say, I remember doing a school project when I was about 9 on Captain Scott, and somehow I ended up with a leaflet about the British Antarctic Survey, and I remember very clearly thinking to myself, I will never get to go there. So never say never.
Amazing. So amazing. And I think also from the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust perspective, I think we're really proud of how much impact we can have with such a tiny organisation and limited funding, and the fact that we can be involved with the protection of the Endurance wreck and the 6 sites that we care for on the continent. And so all of that is dependent on donations from the public, and all of that work that we managed to churn out to keep these buildings standing so that they'll be protected for future generations is something that we're very proud of with our very small team. having an impact on a very niche part of Antarctic history. So thank you to all of you for supporting that, and to all of you that are listening as well, for tuning in today to listen to this really fascinating webinar with such an amazing group of female leaders that we're immensely proud to work very closely with in everything that we do. So thank you to both James and to Kim for turning up today. And really for the audience, thank you so much for sharing your questions and for tuning in. And if, as I did carefully segue into there, we are a charity and we do rely on donations to support all of the work that we do, especially our team at Blakelock, currently working hard at the tiny Blakelock refuge in need of rescue. They're beavering away to get the hut restored right now as we speak in really challenging conditions. So any contributions that you are able to make, perhaps consider joining the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust as a patron, and there are links there and also in the chat. So thank you so much for your support. If you've enjoyed this webinar, I'm afraid this is the last in the series for this year, but there are 15 that you can catch up on YouTube. The last one on dogs in Antarctica was absolutely fascinating, and there's a really wide range of subjects through the webinars and also through our podcast series. So do look up A Voyage to Antarctica as well on any good podcast provider. Right, final thank yous from me to the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust team who've been working backstage in the background. So thank you to Helen and Heather and Jessie for putting all of this together, and to all of you who've been involved as speakers and in the audience. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a very happy International Women's Day and a really enjoyable evening.
Thank you.